So this is a video I made for YouTube. It's about an hour long and it's called Types of Drawing. I recommend you check it out here to get some more context and more clarity. We are going to cover a little bit of that, but it's an hour long just for the distinction between two-dimensional observational drawing versus volume and construction. These are essentially two different types of thinking that you can use with drawing. So if drawing is a language, then these are essentially two different types of description that you can use. How deeply, how in depth do you go with your analysis, with your image? What is your level of understanding of the language? Essentially, if you're a writer and you're using the two-dimensional way of drawing, then you're essentially rewriting something. You're looking at something that's already there, and your goal is to take it from here and put it on your paper. You're essentially attempting not to reconstruct the scene, but to look at the end result of a scene. Let's say we have something here, and your goal is to make that same thing here and put it on your paper, not necessarily understanding why this looks the way that it does in the first place, what makes it look the way that it does. It's essentially a more direct way, a more shallow way, let's call it, less complex at this stage, to just be able to look at something and also reproduce it. Now, this is critical. In terms of our levels here, this is essentially the copying part, but copying being related very much to building a skill set, to having a meaningful progression that will then keep carrying you forward. They will be taking you towards imagination work, let's say, if that is your goal. Now, if you just want to draw observationally, then this may be more than enough. If you're wanting to, let's say, just make a portrait of a friend, or you want to draw your dog, or whatever it is, something that's out there in the world, and you just want to take that and you just want to draw it, then observational may be absolutely fine, and it's in no way lesser. In fact, I find that these two camps, so this is the observational, two-dimensional, and we also have, this will be the three-dimensional camp, separated by this line over here, and instead of just observing now and being able to only interact with something based on a final result and copying that final result, in the volume or construction way of thinking, in the three-dimensional way of thinking, you're actually able to understand the cause and effect relationship, why something looks the way that it does, which then gives you more freedom to manipulate it, to make it express what it is that you would like it to. Now, for a beginner looking at these things, let's say if I show you the 2D way, if I show you this and you look at the final image, you may be more than satisfied with this. And if I show you this image and you might think, well, I don't really like all the lines that are going through, or I don't like it the way that it is, you may be thinking of it more of a stylistic way. So if we look at the final image and we just assess it for what it is, as practitioners, we're actually missing the thinking that went into it. We're missing the skill set that goes into producing this kind of image. So you may not like, let's say, you may not like the final result here. Let's say that it's just not your taste. Well, that's fine. If you have the ability to think like this, though, you can absolutely take something that's like this and then simplify it. You can, after you've constructed the hand here, you can then remove the parts that you don't want, and you can only keep what's essential. This allows you, in a way, to be an editor. You're no longer just a writer. You can now have more control over the final product. You can actually go in there and you have the freedom to make things come out the way that you would like them to. In this camp, you can see we're actually constrained far more to the final result. When we look at observational drawing, in a way, it's been developed to directly take something and put it onto canvas. It's very meticulous and very precise, and it isn't really concerned with the structure of the image. Essentially, it's just concerned with being able to look at something, accurately translate the shapes and proportions that it's made of, and then fill the shapes with the accurate tone to create the illusion of 3 dimensions. Like we said, one of the core purposes of art is to create the illusion of something. So whether you're doing it 2-dimensionally or 3-dimensionally, essentially in both ways, you're just trying to represent objects on a 2-dimensional surface. You're trying to create the illusion of reality on a flat surface. And you may say, well, I'm not really interested in reality. I don't want to make realistic things. I want to make cartoons. I want to make stylized things. And it really doesn't matter. How you choose to draw the style that you choose, the same underlying language, the same visual language is the foundation of visual expression. How you choose to use the language, essentially style is kind of like an accent. Once you know the language, you can really pick and choose how it is that you want to sound or what subject matter it is that you want to talk about. But really, the most important part is language, and that's the hardest part of the training as well. So if one of the primary purposes of drawing is to create the illusion of 3D volumes on a 2D surface, then essentially we need to understand a little bit of how the brain sees the world. Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to trick other brains that are looking at our work to see space in there. So we need to understand how space works, and we need to understand what the brain looks for. How the brain understands visual cues really determines what it is that we can do in terms of style. Why do lines work? Why does tone work? All of these different things are affected by how the brain perceives the world. Now, the reason why lines and contours work is because the brain is always looking for the extent of an object. It's looking for edges. So we essentially have a built-in edge detection. Your brain is constantly trying to separate one thing from another because it's important. It's important to know where we are, and it's important to know what's in the environment. So the immediate thing that we need to do is an extraction. We need to separate things one from the other, which is why line works. Line essentially emulates the edges between different forms that your brain sees. Now, this can be outside edges, so these can be on the outside of a form, and they also could be inner edges. So for instance, here where we have a pretty harsh shape, this is where the brow goes underneath. And when there's a light on this form, this results in a pretty harsh shape over here. So it's where one form has a sharp transition, or where one form meets another form, which is another form of harsh transition. That's where we have edges. And when we're able to draw all of these different shapes correctly, essentially we are reproducing the effect that a true object, when seen in real life, would have on the brain. We're reproducing these patterns of light and dark, and also these edges that tell the brain, hey, this is an object, it takes up this amount of space, and it's also made up of these subforms that are there. And if those subforms match all the different patterns that we have in our brain of what a face is, for instance, then your brain will recognize that it's a face shape. Have a look at some of these examples here, for instance. Look at how faces are represented. Like, look at this face. There's almost nothing here. This is all gone. And yet your brain has perfect information of what is there exactly. You can pretty much tell where the skull ends. You can tell where the hair begins. And yes, there are these small shapes over here that give you a further indication. But really, even if we probably covered those, you would be able to tell that this is where pretty much the skull ends and this is where the hair would begin. You would still have that implicit knowledge of where those things are. And this happens because we've been around for hundreds of thousands of years. We've had all of these things that are encoded in our brains, all of these patterns that our ancestors have seen, all of these common objects that we've been around for millennia. We've always been around other people. We've always been around the same shapes, and we can pretty easily recognize those when we see them, even if they're incomplete. So with faces and with figures, there's a lot of room for being suggestive. What I mean by being suggestive here is that you actually have quite a lot of liberty in what you can portray and what you can hide. But what you cannot be suggestive or loose with is the structure of these things that we're so familiar with. You can't put the eye in the wrong place or put the nose further down or higher up, because that would change the proportion. You would essentially be changing the skull if you did that. So what your brain is constantly looking for is it's looking for structure. It's looking for structure that's recognizable. Look at this image. Again, there's a huge amount of information that's actually omitted, right? This whole thing is just one big shape. And I mean, you can start from here, from the top part of the image, and go down, and this whole entire shape continues. There's a continuous portion of just eliminated detail. There's nothing here. So you could just hide a lot of it as long as it is actually correct. So that poses the question then, does the artist know where everything is? Does the artist actually draw the entire head? And when you look at someone who's very experienced, maybe you never see them draw the whole head. Maybe you just see them do these shapes. So what I'm doing here is I'm pretty much straightforwardly copying these quite abstract shapes. If you look at them in outline, you can see you would probably not be able to recognize this as a face. But when we fill them up with tone, you can see that your brain pretty much immediately picks up that it is a face. Even though it's not identical, it can definitely tell that it's a face. And if it's not identical, but it still reads, then it's obvious then that your brain is just looking for a common pattern. And it's not looking for exactness unless you're looking to reproduce the exact same thing. So if you're looking at an experienced artist, and let's say what we did here is just copying. So it's fairly obvious what it is that we're doing. We're just taking these shapes and we're reproducing them. And then when we put them together, we have our illusion, right? Our basic purpose of drawing here, our creating the illusion. We get that when we just copy what we have because it's already working. But what about if you're an artist who's very experienced and you're looking at them as a beginner and there's nothing to copy? Let's say if we remove this image and we had nothing to look at, no head, no shapes, none of that to copy, how can we possibly make it? How can we do this? And why I drew this head is because if there is nothing to look at, if we take away all these other pictures, if there's nothing that we can copy, then really what the artist is relying on then, and what they have in their head when they're making these shapes, is they have an idea of the underlying structure. The artist will have memorized and they will have studied and trained so many different heads, so many different figures, so many different configurations of these things that they really have developed a sense of where things are. So if someone is making something very quickly, to be able to do something without the reference would mean that we're not looking at shapes. The shapes become the end result. What we're doing is we actually have a structure of the head. We've practiced the head many, many times before. We've studied the structure. We looked at different angles of the head. We actually understand the form that when lit from a particular angle produces certain kinds of shapes. So essentially what we're doing is we're thinking three-dimensionally, we're thinking structurally in order to anticipate what would happen. Now what I have here is a 3D scene and I'm using a software called Modo, but you can absolutely do this with Blender. Blender is a free piece of software and it pretty much has all the functionality of a paid one. So you can just go ahead and set some scenes up for yourself and rotate objects around and see what happens. But what we have here is we just have this head. And hopefully you can see these lines that are on it, so I'm just going to highlight them now. And these lines essentially make up the structure of the head. So what 3D software does is that it actually knows where each and every point is. So these lines that are over top of the head, they're very similar to what we saw with the 3D drawing. With this drawing here, there's essentially each and every one of these lines is defining a surface. It's defining the volume of this object. Now this is also how 3D software works, which is why it's able to look at something and you can rotate a camera. You can actually have an object portrayed from many different angles, and it's because 3D understands. So at the intersection of each and every one of these lines there's a point. So I've enabled the points for you now so you can see them. So at each intersection there's a point, and essentially 3D just has information where each and every point is according to 3D space. So I've just put a plane on the ground here, so I've just put this gray plane just so you can see that there's also a grid that's on the floor here. So this is very similar. If you're familiar with perspective, this is essentially what perspective is. It's just that we're doing it on a piece of paper, whereas here you can actually understand the space a bit better just because it is actually three-dimensional. You can move around in it. So you can see that there's this grid here and essentially it creates the space that we're in, and 3D software understands where each and every point is over here on this head. By having that information, you can then rotate your camera. And essentially when we're working in drawing, when we're working in this way, when you're wanting to make something that doesn't actually exist, the theory is very much the same. We don't have a head here from the side. If we at least have a vague idea of what a head is, if we can simplify it down to some sort of volume for the face, which is an elongated kind of oval, and then if we have, this will be a bit small, let's say if we have a little bit of a volume from the back, now we have this simplified head, and then we can start progressively and making this more complicated. So we can cut a plane. So if we do this, we're essentially creating this. So you can see that the head here has an underplane. It has an underside over here. So these lines, they're going over and under, so they're following the surface of the form. So essentially when we're drawing, when we're trying to do things that we don't have reference for, we're kind of doing the same thing where we have encoded. So we've done many heads at this stage, and we're just going with, we're trying to reproduce these volumes. And none of these are just a shape. All of these are trying to think. Let's say this is from the side. If we had to do it from the front, these are all just trying to visualize and think about volumes in this stage. So I just drew this simplified volumetric head over here in a kind of 3/4 view, just because when you're looking at it this way, it's not as obvious that these aren't just outlines. But when we go to construct something like this, we do have to think dimensionally. We do have to think the same way that 3D software thinks. So when we think about these points that it has, that it's using to define the form over, these are the same things that we're essentially doing, but we're doing them with drawing. So it's almost like you're 3D modeling with drawing. You're 3D modeling on a 2D piece of paper. And this is also how you position things in your scene, your characters, whatever it might be. And that's also afterwards how you think about lighting. When you have a certain direction that the light is coming from, you can then start, based on these simple volumes and your understanding, obviously, of space, start plotting where the shadow shapes would go. Okay, so let's jump back to 3D, and we're going to take this head and we're now going to look at where those shapes come from. So over here what I did is that we just had the head just flat. So you see the lines and they define the head and they define the volumes, they define the structure of it, but there isn't any lighting here. So on this side of the screen, I just have the head as it would look without any shading, and on this side of the screen, the head actually has one light. that's illuminating it. So you can see over here, this is the structure of the head. The lines are all that's required to essentially configure the structure of the head. And then when you put the light over top of it, this is when you end up with the final result of the full rendering. In drawing, you might call it shading, although really what it does is to essentially describe light. So we're going to jump over to this diagram shortly to define what drawing is responsible for and how it gets tangled often with lighting, leading for beginners to results that are not very good. So let's just rotate around our scene here for a sec, and you can see that pretty much no matter which angle you look at it from, you can recognize that it's a head. And even with minimal detail, even with that little present in your scene, your brain can still pretty much pick up on the fact of this being a head. It requires very little information. Now, what if we leave the camera as it is, so the camera's going to stay locked? Now, what if we move the light a little bit? So what if we keep rotating the light, and let's change that now. So you can see the geometry stays the same. Now, why I'm showing you this is because a lot of times with beginners, they'll have all these various ideas about how things would work, and they will tangle things together. So what I'm trying to do here is to show you that structure. So how you define something, how you draw something, and what you use line for, it's essentially there to just create one part of form. It's there to build structure. And then once you have the structure, then you can light it. But when you light something, it doesn't change the structure. So the head never changes in shape. Nothing of the underlying structure of this head changes at all. So these lines describe the head, and that head can then be lit in whatever fashion you would like it to be lit. It never changes the orientation of the head. It never changes the structure of it. It's purely the light that's responsible then for all of these shapes. And you can see how abstract and weird and how many configurations there actually are. There's all of these possible ways that you can light the head, but it remains the same. So hopefully when we look at some of these same images now, you can understand that these shapes were just created by the fact that there's a particular orientation. So with this head, there is the structure and the form, it's still there. It's just that obviously it's very tilted. So you'll have one eye here and the other eye would be going overlapped by many other things, but it absolutely is there. And it is absolutely known by the artist where all of these things are. And what they do is they may not have to draw the entire scene in line. If they have done so many studies and they understand the scene and they've internalized so much information, they may not have to draw things in line. But if they had to, a simplified schematic of this would be that we have a head, and if we were trying to figure out the structure of it, so if we have one eye, then the other eye would be coming out and being overlapped by the rest of the skull. Now, having these actually doesn't really serve us. It makes it a bit hard to read the drawing, to actually look at it and understand what's going on. But because, for instance, there would be a cylinder over here that would be overlapping, right? This would be the neck overlapping the jaw. So if we had the jaw drawn, it would actually be kind of hard to figure out where things are exactly. So it doesn't really serve you to draw absolutely everything and to have it drawn out. It actually sometimes is easier and quicker to just do less. But in trying to understand where things are, you should be able to absolutely figure out how things are going away in space, how they're foreshortening, how they're turning. So this would be, let's say if we were to make these into basic shapes, this would be a sphere and this would be an oval coming from it. And these all will have a very similar feel to that hand that we were looking at so many times. So this is another cylinder going away in space. And the torso over here, it would have a different alignment. So it would actually be going in this direction. So the torso would be oriented like this. So all of these, again, when we're drawing something, and especially if it doesn't exist, you essentially have to construct it. I remember when I was starting out, asking myself all kinds of questions about how things are done. Like, if you can't see something, does the artist know that it's there? And obviously, if they are constructing something, then yes, they do have the ability to draw through the form. That's what Scott Robertson calls it. It's essentially the ability to understand how three-dimensional space works and to also have an understanding of where things are in space and in what relation to each other. It's almost like you're creating a real scene. Because again, if you're making a powerful illusion, you need to be the first person that's tricked by the illusion. You need to be able to see the space in order for someone else to see it. Now, this may sound kind of abstract, but have a look at this drawing, for instance, by Scott Robertson. You can absolutely see that every single point of this form, even though there will be points that are not seen. So if we just had this as a finished drawing, let's say, you would not be able to see what's on the other side of the car, but you can actually see that this is absolutely known in the drawing. All of these section lines and all of these volumes and forms on the far side of the car, they're known. You can see the rear wheel over here, and you can see where the backside of the car is that you wouldn't be able to see here. You can see it's actually overlapped, but you can still figure out where it will be even though you wouldn't see it. And this type of thinking is essential to be able to rotate things in space, to be able to free yourself from having to copy, and to be able to actually put things and stylize them, change them, transform them, deform them, do whatever it is that you want to do, so you're not always constrained to copying, but you can actually think and have your drawing be what you want rather than just what was available from the reference. When we go through the levels, you'll see more and more examples of these, but this is another type of 3D thinking. So what we just saw here with Scott Robertson, this is a great method for objects that are technical, let's say if they're manufactured, because they have very precise points and you're essentially building them. I mean, if let's say if a car is an object that's built, if it's a machine and it's created by other machines, it makes sense to use a type of drawing that is very machine-like. So you can see it's very precise, it's very technical, it's very measured, it's very accurate. You can see for something that's organic, you would have so many different points that you would have to take care of. So we're not talking perspective yet at this stage, but if you had all of these fingers, they would be going to different vanishing points. And not only that, but you have the hand is, let's say, in an orientation that is different to the thumb. So you have all of these different planes and volumes that you would have to orient in space in order to understand where they are. If you had to create this in the same way that you would create the machine drawing, you would have so many different vanishing points. It would get so complex, it would be very hard to do. This is a type of drawing that is very highly developed and very highly skilled. Essentially, if you're watching Steve Houston draw or Glenn Vilppu, they are feeling the space. They are feeling the imaginary space. Now this may sound, again, kind of like a Yoda moment, but if you listen to Glenn Vilppu, he'll say, let's say, I'm feeling, if you were drawing this, he would say, I'm feeling the thumb over here. I'm feeling the sphere of the thumb. So I'm feeling the thumb, and I'm feeling that it's spherical. I'm feeling that there is actually volume, that this isn't just a circle. So if we have it like this could be a circle. This could just be flat. So if we look at it from the side, for instance, it looks like this. There's nothing there. Or from the top, it looks like this. So it's just a flat shape. But if we're to turn it into a sphere, then we need to really understand, first we need to understand how the illusion is created. So we'll talk more about that in the levels. But when you train these and when you drill them and you've done this over and over again, then your brain speeds up to the point where you can actually feel how things are going away or they're coming towards you. So Glenn Vilppu would say something like, I'm feeling the thumb, I'm feeling how it's going inwards, or I'm feeling the overlap. Let's say if we have this form over here that's under the thumb, he may say that he is feeling this overlap. And you can see how this is emphasized by this thickening of the line over here. This isn't just stylistic though. This is actually showing overlap. This is trying to feel what's happening. This is the artist essentially describing to themselves as they're drawing what it is that they're drawing. So feeling how this shape is under this shape, feeling the volume of this minor shape, feeling how it actually has volume, that it isn't just a line, that it isn't just a shape anymore, feeling that it actually has volume. And you can see all of these lines, they are describing a volume. This feels like a very volumetric drawing. It feels like it's taking up space. It feels like it isn't just a flat outline. It isn't just a contour of something. You can actually understand how much space each and everything is taking, how it's fitting in with other shapes, or with other forms, I should say. You can actually feel the connection between these different parts. Now, when you're drawing like this, you're not necessarily trying to copy anything. And if I did this from, let's say, a photograph and not from a drawing where there actually aren't any of those lines, then really what you're trying to do is you're trying to fill out the space. You're trying to actually convince yourself of the illusion. You're trying to create through the drawing this feeling of space. Like when I'm making these lines over here, I'm actually suggesting that there is a corner here. So I'm actually trying to feel that as I'm doing it. So I'm thinking through where the forms are. I'm thinking through what's happening. And then when I go here, I'm actually going to try and feel out the fact that there is a rounding, that I'm going around this form. So I'm actually almost trying to feel and explain to myself what all of these different things are. And so you can contrast that to this type of drawing where when you look at the final, there really isn't anything here. So there's nothing that makes you feel the form. Apart from this one shape that gives you the geometry, that explains that there is a plane here that is going under, these areas are pretty much left barren. So your brain can actually kind of interpret this, but really, if we look at this, then this could just be a straight line. So this guy could just have a very straight forehead like this, and it could just be completely sideways. There's no way to tell what's happening. There's nothing that would actually describe that this is a plane and then it's facing forward. So if we look at this from the side, let's say it would probably be slanted backwards a bit, but it would be facing forward, and then this plane would be at an angle to it. So this plane would actually be something like this. It would be at an angle. If we're looking at it from the top, let's say we'll have like this, and then this plane is facing this direction. Now, it may not make too much of a difference with just the drawing, but if we had lighting on here, if we had to apply some light, then it's crucial that you understand that these parts of the forehead are facing in different directions in order to be able to apply your lighting correctly. Because let's say if the light is coming from this side, well, then this plane is either in shadow or it's the darkest out of the three over here. So the volumetric and three-dimensional type of drawing is very important when it comes to afterwards painting, to thinking about light, etc. It really is what opens the door to imagination work. Because with observational, I mean, that's why I've called it observational drawing, because essentially you're relying on being able to see something to draw from it. So like we said, if you're a writer, then this is essentially you are rewriting something that's already there, which is good. This is fine practice. And also, as you get more experience, like I said, these aren't opposed. These actually work together. In order, let's say, to be able to create accurate shapes that you can then turn into volumes and feel the volume, etc. To be able to do all that stuff, it relies on the fact that you can at least produce some shapes where you need them to be and in the size and orientation that you need them to be in. So before you make things more complex, it relies on you having a simpler understanding and being able to execute on that simpler level. The more that you can understand why something looks the way that it does in your scene, the more that you can play with your shapes and stylize them. And let's say even if you are doing a portrait of someone, if you have the three-dimensional understanding, well then you can stylize the portrait. You can change how things look. Let's say you can change the orientation of the light, or you can change a feature and not distort it to the point where it's now broken. So it becomes this kind of hybrid thinking where sometimes also you'll be just looking at something, so you might just make a two-dimensional shape. But then if you have three-dimensional thinking, then if you've trained that, then you might just be able to look at that shape and think of it as a three-dimensional object. So this could, let's say it's no longer just a two-dimensional shape, whatever it is that you make, but it now has dimension. Your brain can actually see in it more than it just was. So let's say this is some sort of pouch that will convert this thing into. It was just a flat shape before, but now it's some sort of object. So you can start doing almost like this Rorschach type of play, and you'll see a lot of designers do that, where you can just either put down some silhouettes or some shapes and just start looking into this thing and then coming up with stuff. So this could be a dragon, it could be a piece of architecture. You can just start putting down these shapes that really have no third dimension to them, but since you've trained your three-dimensional thinking, then you can take these things and you can start converting them into something different.